At the beginning of any relationship, honesty feels like the foundation on which everything else is built. Two people share their thoughts, their fears, their past experiences, believing that truth creates connection. In a healthy relationship, honesty becomes a bridge. It allows two individuals to understand one another more deeply. But in a relationship with a narcissistic woman, something very different begins to happen. Gradually, almost invisibly, honesty stops being a bridge and begins to turn into a weapon. When you speak openly about your struggles, your insecurities, or the things that matter most to you, you believe you are strengthening the bond between you. You believe vulnerability will be respected. Yet with a narcissistic personality, vulnerability is often treated not as something sacred, but as something useful. Information becomes leverage. The details you share about your fears, your past mistakes, or your emotional wounds are quietly stored away. They are remembered not for empathy, but for strategic advantage. And the strange thing is that this does not happen immediately. In the beginning, she may appear deeply interested in your inner world. She may listen carefully, ask thoughtful questions, even encourage you to open up more. This creates the illusion of emotional safety. But later, during moments of conflict, those same confessions may suddenly reappear, twisted, exaggerated, or thrown back at you in ways you never expected. A private insecurity becomes an insult. A past mistake becomes permanent evidence of your supposed flaws. Your honesty, which was meant to bring understanding, is now used to undermine your confidence and weaken your position. Psychologically, this creates a profound shift inside the partner. Slowly, the mind learns a painful lesson. Honesty is dangerous here. The more truth you reveal, the more exposed you become. And so, without even realizing it, a person begins to withdraw parts of themselves. They become more cautious with their words, more guarded with their feelings. This is the first quiet death inside such relationships, the moment when honesty no longer feels safe, and when truth becomes a liability instead of a bond. The foundation of the relationship has already begun to collapse. Once honesty has been quietly weakened, another pattern begins to take its place. Where truth once stood, strategy slowly enters the relationship. And this is where many people become deeply confused, because the shift is rarely obvious at first. It does not appear as constant, blatant lying. Instead, it shows up as small distortions of reality, carefully shaped stories, selective truths, and convenient omissions that serve a very specific purpose. In relationships with narcissistic women, truth is often not treated as something sacred or stabilizing. Instead, it becomes flexible, almost like a tool that can be adjusted depending on the situation. If the truth protects her image, it may be told confidently. But if the truth threatens her sense of superiority or exposes a flaw, it is quickly reshaped into something else. What begins to emerge is a pattern of strategic dishonesty. Statements contradict previous statements. Promises dissolve when they are no longer useful. Facts are rearranged in ways that shift responsibility away from her and toward others. And yet, these changes are often delivered with such certainty that they can make the other person question their own understanding of events. Psychologically, this is not random behavior. The narcissistic personality is deeply invested in maintaining a carefully constructed identity, an image of control, perfection, or moral superiority. Any truth that threatens this identity must be neutralized. And one of the easiest ways to neutralize truth is to replace it with a more convenient narrative. Over time, this creates an environment where reality itself becomes unstable. Conversations feel confusing. Explanations never quite add up. You may notice that stories change depending on the audience, or that yesterday's certainty suddenly becomes today's denial. For the partner, this creates a subtle but exhausting mental tension. You find yourself trying to keep track of what was said, what actually happened, and what is now being claimed. But the deeper problem is not simply the presence of lies. It is the erosion of a shared reality. And when two people can no longer stand on the same ground of truth, the relationship slowly transforms into a psychological battlefield where perception itself becomes the first casualty. Once truth has been replaced with carefully constructed narratives, the next stage is even more destabilizing. This is where a psychological tactic begins to take hold that slowly erodes a person's confidence in their own perception of reality. What makes it so dangerous is not simply that someone lies, but that they insist, with absolute conviction, that what you clearly experienced never happened at all. Imagine recalling a conversation where certain words were spoken, certain promises were made, or certain actions took place. To you, the memory is clear. But when you bring it up, you are met not with discussion, but with denial. She looks at you with certainty and says, "That never happened," or "You're imagining things," or perhaps, "You always twist everything. At first, you resist this. You trust your memory. You know what you heard." But when this happens repeatedly, something subtle begins to occur in the mind. Each denial plants a small seed of doubt. Each contradiction introduces a tiny fracture in your certainty. Over time, these fractures begin to accumulate. You replay conversations in your mind, wondering if you misunderstood. You question your interpretation of events. You begin to second guess your own emotional reactions. This is the deeper psychological impact of gaslighting. It does not simply alter facts. It alters the relationship you have with your own perception. Your inner compass, your ability to trust what you see, hear, and feel, starts to weaken. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of confronting reality as it is, because psychological health depends on maintaining a stable relationship with truth. But when someone repeatedly manipulates reality around you, the mind begins to lose its footing. You no longer feel grounded in what you know to be real. And once a person begins to doubt their own perception, they become far easier to control. Decisions become hesitant. Confrontations become timid. Silence begins to feel safer than speaking. This is the quiet, psychological victory of gaslighting. It does not just distort reality. It convinces you that your ability to recognize reality cannot be trusted. As this pattern continues, another subtle but powerful shift begins to take place within the relationship. The space where emotional honesty should exist slowly becomes unsafe. In a healthy partnership, emotional transparency is the very thing that deepens intimacy. When someone expresses fear, sadness, confusion, or vulnerability, the natural response is understanding. It is through these moments that two people begin to truly see each other. But in a relationship with a narcissistic woman, emotional openness often produces the opposite reaction. Instead of empathy, vulnerability may be met with indifference, impatience, or even quiet contempt. You may speak about something that hurt you, hoping to resolve tension or create understanding, only to find your feelings dismissed as exaggeration. "You're too sensitive," she might say. Or perhaps, "You're overreacting again." At first, these responses feel confusing. You assume it must be a misunderstanding. After all, expressing emotions is supposed to bring clarity, but gradually you begin to notice a pattern. Each time you reveal something genuine about your inner experience, the reaction does not bring you closer. It pushes you further away. Psychologically, this creates a painful contradiction. The very act that should strengthen connection becomes a source of criticism or ridicule. And because human beings naturally seek emotional safety, the mind begins to adapt. You start filtering what you say. You hold back certain feelings. You tell yourself it is easier to remain calm and silent than to risk another dismissive response. Over time, this quiet self-censorship grows stronger. Conversations become more superficial. The deeper parts of your emotional life slowly retreat into the background, not because they disappeared, but because they no longer feel welcome in the relationship. Carl Jung often emphasized that the human psyche longs to be seen and acknowledged. When a person's emotional reality is repeatedly invalidated, a form of psychological isolation begins to emerge, even while standing beside someone who claims to care. And when honesty about your own feelings becomes something you must hide, the relationship stops being a place of connection and quietly becomes a place of emotional exile.
As honesty weakens, truth becomes distorted, and emotional openness is punished. Another essential pillar of any healthy relationship begins to disappear: accountability. In any meaningful partnership, mistakes are inevitable. Two human beings will misunderstand each other, hurt each other unintentionally, and occasionally act out of frustration or fear. What sustains the relationship is not perfection, but the willingness to acknowledge those mistakes and take responsibility for them. Accountability is, in many ways, the quiet guardian of honesty. When someone can say, "Yes, I was wrong," or "I should not have spoken that way," trust is restored. It reassures the other person that truth still matters more than pride. But in relationships with narcissistic women, this simple act of responsibility becomes extraordinarily rare. Instead, a different pattern takes hold. When confronted with something hurtful she has done, the conversation rarely moves toward reflection or self-examination. Rather, it quickly shifts direction. The blame begins to travel. Suddenly, the focus is no longer on her behavior, but on yours. Perhaps you are told that you provoked the reaction. Perhaps the original issue is dismissed entirely and replaced with a list of your supposed faults. What began as a discussion about one action becomes a courtroom where you are unexpectedly the one on trial. Psychologically, this maneuver serves a very specific function. The narcissistic personality is built around protecting a fragile sense of superiority. To admit fault would threaten that image, and so the mind constructs elaborate defenses to redirect responsibility elsewhere. Blame becomes a shield, and denial becomes a strategy of survival. For the partner, this creates a deeply frustrating experience. You may approach the conversation hoping for resolution, hoping for a moment of honesty where both people acknowledge their part. Instead, you leave the discussion feeling confused, defensive, and somehow responsible for a problem you did not create. Over time, this destroys the balance within the relationship. One person is expected to reflect, apologize, and adjust, while the other remains permanently beyond criticism. And when accountability disappears, honesty no longer has anywhere to stand, because truth without responsibility is nothing more than a conversation that never leads to change. After all these patterns unfold the weaponization of honesty, the quiet replacement of truth with strategic narratives, the slow corrosion of reality through gaslighting, the punishment of emotional openness, and the disappearance of accountability, something profound begins to happen within the partner. It is not always loud or dramatic. In fact, it often happens silently, almost invisibly. The person simply begins to speak less. At first, this silence is subtle. You hesitate before sharing a thought. You rethink whether it is worth explaining how you feel. You ask yourself if bringing up a concern will only lead to confusion, denial, or another exhausting argument. Gradually, the mind starts to calculate the emotional cost of honesty, and when that cost becomes too high, silence begins to feel safer. This is one of the most tragic transformations within such relationships. A person who once valued openness, who believed that truth and communication were the foundation of connection, slowly learns to withhold parts of themselves. Conversations become carefully measured. Words are chosen not for authenticity, but for survival. Psychologically, this is a form of adaptation. The mind is trying to protect itself from repeated conflict, dismissal, and manipulation, but the cost of this protection is significant. Each time a person chooses silence over honesty, a small piece of their authenticity retreats into the background. Carl Jung often spoke about the importance of integrating one's inner truth into the external world, of living in a way where what we think, feel, and say remain aligned. When a person is forced to silence their inner reality simply to maintain peace in a relationship, that alignment begins to fracture. The result is not merely a quiet relationship, but a hollow one. Two people may still share space, conversation, and routine, but the deeper psychological presence, the honest exchange of inner worlds, has quietly disappeared. And this is the final stage in the death of honesty, not when people begin to lie, but when someone no longer feels safe enough to tell the truth at all. Because the moment silence replaces authenticity, the relationship has already lost the very thing that once gave it life.